highly regarded in his field. He's also, and some of us have had more contact with him as a result of this, he's deputy chair of the REF subpanel 33, which is music, dance, drama, performing arts, film and screen studies. And he effectively is the our music lead. So please welcome Robert Adlington to give our first presentation of the Research Forum this year.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you very much. And thanks to everybody for being there. I hope you can hear me okay. Is the sound all right? Great. Yeah, it's lovely to see so many valued colleagues, many of you I've worked with closely, some former students. I think I see Devon there. It's great to see you, Devon. Hi, it's been a while. So thank you for making the time to join us all today. So this arises from a larger project that I've been involved with for a few years, looking at music and democracy. And I'm going to be talking about, it sort of feels like I'm talking about two things that at our present moment are imperiled. And I want to just say a word about that at the outset. I'm going to talk about music making, and I'm going to talk about democracy. And this seems a particularly acute time for both of those things. And we know what the current challenges are for performers in this country at the moment, and we can't escape the many would say perilous state of democracy. And I feel a bit bad because I'm going to actually be asking some critical questions about both of those things, and I feel a bit bad doing so because in a way what we need more of is we need more democracy and we need more music making. But in asking questions about, for instance, how democratic certain kinds of music making are, and indeed how democratic democracy is, I hope that I'm mounting a kind of defense. I think democracy is better defended when we understand its limits and the difficulties that attend the idea and the principles of democracy. And equally, ensemble music making, which is what I'm going to focus on today, you know, I don't think there's any sense in which it's delegitimized or made less important by questioning, if you like, some of the more utopian claims that are made about ensemble music making. So I wanted to say that at the outset so that it doesn't seem as if I'm operating completely blind and deaf to the huge pressing challenges that many of us are facing at the moment. So let me dive straight in, and I'm going to share my PowerPoint slide if I can. Is that okay? Can you see it? Great. So here's my first question. What is the relation of music and democracy? And I'll just say a little bit about my way into this subject, how I came to be thinking about this conjunction in a bit of shameless self-publicizing. Here's the cover of a couple of my books. So my way into this subject was through the 1960s, and I did quite a bit of work looking at avant-garde music in the 60s, and especially avant-garde musicians who became very invested in the political movements of the 60s. And as you can probably imagine, democratization was most definitely a buzzword at the time. And in sort of looking into the way in which musicians in the 60s were talking about democratization, I became aware, well, of two things. Firstly, a sort of persistent disillusionment that seemed to accompany this attempt to make music more democratic. And it often seemed to fall short of the aspirations that musicians had for their various experiments. And that in turn seemed to point to what I came to decide was a rather uninquiring attitude to democracy itself. In other words, musicians, I think generally when they've used that term in relation to their practice, have tended to do so in quite a casual way and without really thinking what they mean by it. It sounds like a great idea, democracy, but you don't have to dig very far in political theory to learn that democracy is an incredibly complex notion. Its attempts have been made to realize it in very different kinds of ways. And it's by no means, well, I mean, we're aware of this, I think, now in our present moment. Democracy is by no means a straightforward recipe to contentment and happiness of all. I think that these days goes without saying. So the 1960s was my way into this, but there is, of course, a wider and longer history of connecting music and democracy. And that really dates back certainly 100 years to the, if you like, the advent of mass suffrage. And it manifests itself in different ways. So it could be a question of musical style. So, for example, you could take a composer like Percy Grainger, who wrote articles on music and democracy, and his focus was very much on compositional texture as a means to embody ideas of democracy. He was interested in approaches to polyphony that seemed to sort of exemplify this idea of equality, of many converging into a kind of harmonious unity. Or we might think about the debates around postmodernism in the 1980s and 1990s, certain musical styles being seen as democratic because they're more accessible. Also discourse around traditional and folk music. People have written of folk music as being a democratic music because it connects to these long national histories of popular traditions. So we can think about music and democracy in terms of musical style. We can think about it in terms of music's role in social movements. Here we might want to think about protest songs, struggles for emancipation. Music obviously is a very effective tool in furthering these goals, and so seems to be a force for democratic sentiment. Also thinking about democracy in terms of the relationships within music making. So composers certainly in the 60s were interested in experimenting with new relationships between composers and performers, and also new relationships between musicians and audiences, trying to get away from traditional hierarchical arrangements and exploring new ways in which those participants could interrelate. And also, I think, and this is going to be my focus today, very important to this area of music and democracy, is how performers relate to each other. And that's really what I'm going to home in on in what I've got to say today. And this interest in the interrelationship between performers has been very important in jazz, very important, I think, in thinking about classical chamber music, and also free improvisation, which is where I'm going to end up later on in this talk. So just for a bit more self-publicizing, I've recently finished editing a volume, lots of contributors from different countries, different institutions, looking at various different ways in which music and democracy come together, and that's going to be out, in fact, next month, hopefully. So, I think the association between music and democracy has been especially rich in thinking about small ensembles. So I'll begin with the classic example of the string quartet. There's a long history of regarding the form as it were, modeling an ideal polity. And there's a wonderful article by Mary Hunter where she writes of quartets both as compositions and as performance, modeling a polity where voluntarily discharging mutual obligations on a basis of equality and respect results in freedom. And Hunter, it's a terrific article. I've got the references at the end of my presentation. She goes right back to the early 19th century and looks at the way in which quartet playing in particular was seen as valuable for the way in which it balanced individual freedom and collective responsibility, sort of drawing on ideas that already were familiar at the time, along the lines of what Goethe said famously about listening to quartets being hearing a few intelligent people conversing with each other. And this caught on and became a kind of important marketing device almost for string quartets. So, of course, the implicit comparison when small chamber ensembles are aligned to democracy, the comparison that's being made, I think, very often is with the symphony orchestra. In chamber music, in contrast with a symphony orchestra, musicians have high levels of relative autonomy. They're often performing their own part rather than in massed ranks with others. They have a relative equality, even where there's differentials, let's say, between the second violin and the first violin in a quartet. There is still this sense of them being essential to the musical texture. All players in chamber music have an active and creative involvement. In other words, they're not just passively receiving the instructions of others. And these things apply, obviously, not just to classical chamber music, but in different ways to rock bands. There's research on creative process in rock music that identifies the same sort of quasi-democratic qualities, jazz groups, and improvisation as well. So there is this history of thinking about chamber music and small ensembles in relation to democracy. I find it's quite helpful to have a think about what idea of democracy underpins this comparison. And I think the answer is what's known as deliberative democracy, which is an idea that's gaining a little bit more publicity and familiarity, I think, in the present day. Deliberative democracy is the kind of democratic decision-making that takes place in citizens' assemblies. And I don't know if any of you followed the developments in France, but recently there's been a very significant citizens' assembly convened to discuss the climate crisis. So the government in France has decided that they want to hand over decision-making as to how to respond to the climate crisis to a group of citizens who convene and are actively collaborating to decide policy. So deliberative democracy is an approach to democracy that's to do with direct participation, listening to others, readiness to adapt and to change one's own preference in light of what you hear to others, weighing of the interests of all. And a key thinker in advancing this idea of deliberative democracy was Jürgen Habermas, who wrote quite extensively about the way in which adopting an approach to rationality would help all participants towards a kind of harmonious consensus. So this is a kind of democracy that's quite different, for instance, from representative democracy, where important decisions are, as it were, handed over to a select band of the elected few, if you like. And it's also different from a sort of a referendum-oriented model of democracy, where, in a way, the emphasis is taken away from listening to others, and a body of citizens are just asked, what's your existing view on a matter? So it's very much based around discussion, listening, accommodation to others. And I think that's the model that underpins this comparison between small ensembles and democracy. Fortunately, for those people who are interested in this idea, we can find some support for the idea that small ensemble music making adheres to some of these values, these democratic values. If we look at some of the empirical research that's been undertaken on ensemble interaction in the last 20, 30 years or so. And I saw that Professor Ginsburg was in the audience. That's very exciting because I've used her research on this area. Empirical research on ensemble performance really highlights two things. Firstly, a relative equality in terms of the relationship between musicians. Leadership is shared, and this very influential idea of distributed creativity has sprung up. In other words, the idea that creativity is no longer the possession of one genius figure, but is in a way shared between all who are active in bringing music to life. So equality emerges as very important in chamber music performance, and so does the negotiation of difference. And often you'll find this encapsulated in interest in the idea in conversation, that even the actual practice of making music together with other people has a conversational quality. So the word conversation is sometimes used not just in relation to verbal exchanges in rehearsal, but also the actual act of playing together. I love this quote, that ensemble performers are conversational with the eyes, the gestures they use to coordinate and for timing and for making decisions as they go along about how to interpret a passage, has this sort of quality of conversation to it. A couple of other quotes from this literature. Group rehearsal in these empirical studies emerges as the working out of a shared view, and this sense of evaluation being important, that even in making, in the process of making music together, there's this sense of evaluating and weighing up what each individual musician is doing. And I think all of these things resonate very much with the idea of deliberation. So all of that is to say, yes, there are aspects to small ensemble practice that resemble deliberative democracy. And I certainly don't want to dispute the egalitarian aspects of much chamber music practice or its capacity to encompass difference. I think these are both things that are valued, cherished by many ensemble musicians. But I do worry a little bit sometimes when these democratic elements of small ensemble performance are, as it were, sort of blown out of proportion. And there is a slight tendency, I think, sometimes for if you like, the democratic aspects of ensemble music making to become a bit of a marketing device. So just a couple of examples. The Stanford Philosophy Department, of all places, hosted this workshop as part of a series of events on democracy, where a string quartet was invited to illustrate the origins of the quartet as a democratic institution. And another quartet, the Emerson Quartet, this is on YouTube, a little video for the Lincoln Center, where the Emerson String Quartet demonstrates in words and music their unique democratic nature in how they develop programs, rehearse, and explore options for interpretation. And also coming from the States, where of course the idea of democracy has a very particular resonance and significance, some interesting work being done in the field of education that compares jazz and democracy. So Winston Marsalis is a key figure in this movement, and he's promoted very much the idea of traditional jazz as a kind of crucible for the American idea of freedom of speech, obviously improvisation being an important aspect of that, but also the turn-taking that you find in traditional jazz and the adherence to shared norms that certainly he believes is an important aspect of American democracy. So in a program like this, Let Freedom Swing, I think jazz is accorded a kind of virtue on account of its democratic nature. So these deployments of democracy as a way to attach value to certain kinds of musical practice lead me to want to ask what in ensemble music making is actually quite unlike deliberative democracy. How far can we go in making the parallel? I'll highlight a couple of things that also actually emerge from the empirical research on ensemble performance. Firstly, I think a clear sense that ensemble performance often originates in a like-mindedness. In other words, a set of shared points of departure that kind of make it easy for people to get along. So this could be the simple fact of an ensemble being based in existing friendships or in similar tastes. And then, of course, within different performance traditions, other kinds of loyalty that mean that, unlike in a citizens' assembly, for instance, where often you are bringing together people who have very sharply divided points of view on a particular matter, this is actually quite an unusual thing for ensemble performance, to bring together people with these sharply different outlooks on how to go about their business. So like-mindedness, I think, is something that distinguishes small ensemble music making from many deliberative contexts. And here I'm quoting from Professor Ginsburg, a really nice bit of research that looks even at brand new ensembles where people are coming together not knowing each other. And the empirical research suggests that music making, even in this context where people are strangers, is relatively lacking in the kinds of conflict and antagonism that are often found in other kinds of groups when they first form. So this model of forming, norming, and performing, which is quite an influential model for thinking about new groups. And Jane Ginsburg observes how the empirical research suggests that actually storming kind of doesn't happen in musical contexts. And norming and performing are exemplified by a relative lack of disagreement. Other things that I think constrain the comparison with deliberative democracy, a sense that ensemble music making often involves a kind of suspension of individuality, what's been referred to as a self-other merging, or I found the phrase empathetic attunement, that successful ensemble music making is not to do with bringing your interests and your private concerns to a collective situation, but almost to do with dissolving away those private interests. It's a nice phrase from an article on improvisation, this idea of deferring to what the music wants. And I don't think there's a clear parallel to that in a deliberative context, where often you very much want to represent your point of view clearly, and that's the challenge in a way for a democratic forum, is to find ways to mediate between those strongly represented points of view. There's the fact that ensemble performance is embodied. In other words, it's the way it unfolds is determined as much by the capacity of our physicality, our corporeality, as by what might be happening in our brains. Deliberation, in its purest sense, attaches great value to reflection, whereas I think often in ensemble performance where we have to rely on instinct and knee-jerk reactions, which are often the result of extensive training. But there is, I think, the embodied aspects of musical performance constrain the parallel with deliberation. And there are pragmatic issues to do with employment arrangements, for instance, or the need to satisfy a paying audience that might also just inevitably mean that democratic principles don't apply in the same way. So I'm just going to quote Nicholas Cook. I think this is a useful sort of motto to bear in mind, that there is a tendency to mythologize musical community and to attribute it as having capacities and potential out of a kind of misty-eyed romanticism that we should be aware of. Okay. So, with all that in mind, I think it's interesting, I hope it's interesting, to turn to a kind of limit case for ensemble performance, and that's group-free improvisation. What I've said so far is that the democracy parallel is limited for many kinds of ensemble performance for the reasons I've just discussed. But group-free improvisation is interesting because of the way in which it tries to eliminate some of those constraints that I just described that affect other kinds of music making. And this is well summarized in David Toop's 2016 book, Into the Maelstrom. Group improvisation, as he describes it, is a music without score, notation, image or text, composer, director or conductor, and music spurning reliance on tradition, established forms or hierarchies of labor, lacking in plans, rules or protocols of any kind, other than the act of playing through listening, and which involves foregoing the option of telling others what to do or in training them to my purpose. In other words, this is a practice committed to the freedoms and the leveling that come from eradicating the figure of the composer and fixed scores, from the apparent disregard for ensemble conventions and stylistic norms, and the lack of interest in audience gratification and market success in many of the statements that are made by, or have been made by leading improvisers. So just to give you a little bit of a rest from my voice, I will just play a short snatch from classic video of one of the key early improvisation groups, Spontaneous Music Ensemble, just in case any of you are unfamiliar with this practice. Now let me see if I can share with you my browser screen. Here we go. If Barbara and Michelle, if you can just put your thumb up if this is working. Okay, are you back on my PowerPoint slide? Great. Technology working, fantastic. So that was John Stevens at the end on Kit, who founded the Spontaneous Music Ensemble. A really striking aspect of the discourse around group-free improvisation is the way in which difference is valued. And I think this is why it's an interesting practice to look at, because we said earlier on that one of the things that constrains the parallel between many kinds of ensemble performance and democracy is that the starting point is similarity or like-mindedness. But what's very striking, I think, about the language around group-free improvisation is the way that difference is consciously embraced. So just a few quotes for you. A collective dialogical practice that embraces rather than suppresses dissent, idiosyncrasy and independence. A way of incorporating disagreements as long as each allows the other room and recognizes their existence. It's like a non-verbal debate. Free improvisation's most remarkable characteristic is the ability to incorporate and negotiate disparate perspectives and worldviews. And so on. And this has even led to group improvisation being regarded as, you see the last quote there, a liberatory model for human interaction. So there was a very influential research project in Guelph in Canada that looked at the potential for viewing improvisation, collective improvisation, as a new model for society. It was called Improvisation, Community and Social Practice. So, on the one hand, we have claims about group-free improvisation valuing difference in a way that really marks it out from other kinds of ensemble music making. On the other hand, something that you don't have to read too far into the history of free improvisation to realize is that actually this is a practice that's had more than its fair share of acrimony, feuds, group breakups, and perceptions of exclusion and marginalization. Some of the leading free improvisation groups went through numerous splits and splinters and had actually quite a fraught existence. Which interests me because if difference is valued and free improvisers want to accommodate difference within their practice, why do we end up with these breakups in groups? What's causing that? It suggests that after all, there is some constraint on the accommodation of difference in this musical tradition. So really the kind of key claim of this presentation is this, that I think if we want to understand the prospects for an equal and inclusive ensemble practice, whatever form that might take, it's instructive to take a closer look at contemporary theories of deliberation. And when I say contemporary, I mean present day writings on deliberation that take a slightly different approach from the classic theories that were developed by people like Habermas in the 1980s. These present day theories have increasingly sought to recognize that the level playing field of discussion is not level at all, but is skewed by all manner of factors that affect people's ability to participate on equal terms. So, for instance, it's all very well bringing together a group of people to share their different ideas in a forum. But that doesn't necessarily even out the differences that exist between people's varying speaking skills and styles. People have different levels of confidence, they have different attitudes to assent and conflict, they have different levels of stamina to see out long, complicated discussions. Prejudices exist as to how people are heard. So these may be prejudices against particular ways of talking that are not viewed legitimate or sufficiently, if you like, rational. Particular worldviews might be dismissed or discounted as being eccentric or non-mainstream. Physical appearance also can affect how people listen to you. There's a nice phrase in a recent article on deliberations that says, "We have spoken before we speak," because of the way in which people make judgments based on how you look, your ethnicity, your age, your gender, what you're wearing, and so on. And the histories of groups affect the power relations and interactional norms. So, for instance, who founded the group can skew the balance within a democratic organization, or the contexts for establishment of groups. Was it founded within a church setting or an educational setting? These things will sometimes establish styles of deliberation that may be preferential for some participants and may discriminate against or marginalize other participants. And a few references there to some of these writings that the DeVoe is a particularly great summary of this set of concerns around the possibility of an equal forum for sharing ideas. So really, I think the implication that emerges from this is that democratic discussion involves two levels of difference. There are the differences regarding, if you like, your opinion or what it is you want to say, a preferred course of action. But there are also differences in how you want to say it. And these are referred to variously as speech cultures, discursive modes, or citizenship styles. And current theory on deliberation is very preoccupied with this second level of difference, that you can't claim to have an inclusive democracy if you only seek to accommodate the first level of difference, but you don't attend to the second, because the second, the how you contribute and participate in a collective situation, is crucial to establishing equality. So this binary level of difference that needs to be recognized and accommodated within an inclusive democracy. So my little thought experiment really is, well, what relevance might this have for democratic music making? Does it have any connection to situations that might arise in a musical context? Well, I think evidence that it might is suggested by this completely fascinating PhD thesis, which is freely available online. Go and find it, by Ritwik Banerjee. Actually presented in an ethnomusicological context. So it's an ethnographic study of free improvisation practice in various countries around the world. And what I find really interesting about this project is that it both accepts that egalitarianism and inclusion are foundational for free improvisation, but it also is very interested in improvisers' perceptions of inequality, which are not often voiced within the culture of free improvisation. The reason they're not often voiced is because, of course, free improvisation is supposed to accommodate difference, and the fact that you don't actually like how somebody else plays feels a bit inappropriate to articulate that, because this is a practice that isn't supposed to erect those boundaries. As Banerjee writes, the egalitarian pressure to steer clear of judgmental talk about other musicians leads improvisers to quietly put up with the inequalities they're made to experience in the moment of play. So Banerjee was struck by this difference between how the culture presents itself and the fact that in private, improvisers may feel that they are actually being, either sidelined or marginalized, or that there are limits to the capacity of free improvisation to accommodate difference. And his solution to researching this was to create a bit of software, which is called Maxine, which is basically a co-improviser, but it's not human. It's based on a Max MSP bit of software. And his fieldwork involved encouraging his collaborators to perform together with the software and then to tell him what they thought about the software. Was it any good? Did it improvise like a real person? With the theory being that people would be more open about talking about the software than they would be talking about human beings. So from this feedback that he received from these people playing with Maxine, the software, he discerned what he calls two preferred styles of practicing egalitarianism. Firstly, players who prefer to experience a sense of sympathy, cooperation, and closeness in the way that others interact with them. And contrarily, players who prefer an interactivity of defiance, implicitly assuming that greater independence from other players leads to a stronger experience that no player is in charge. So I think these two preferences, I mean, he's simplifying a spectrum that he finds, but it seemed that improvisers generally hewed in one direction or the other. I think these preferences can be correlated to the discursive modes or citizenship styles discussed by present-day democracy theorists. In other words, the second level of difference, because performers on either side of this dichotomy embrace difference, but they also have preferences as to how the difference is contributed or shared. So free improvisers, if you like, embrace co-performers who want to say different things, but they're not so accommodating always about how they contribute. Differences are accepted at one level, but not the other. And if we go back through the history of group improvisation, we find some quite well-known cases where this limit or constraint on how people contribute and participate, on the citizenship style that they adopt, actually became quite determining for the practice. So in the case of the feminist improvising group founded in 1977, it was directly in response to a sense that the preferred citizenship style or discursive mode of women performers was not valued in the predominantly male groups that existed at the time. So Georgina Bourne, who's the cellist there, one of the founding members of the group, has talked about how the feminist improvising group arose from experiences of exclusion in male-dominated groups, tiny instants or sustained passages of interactive sonic domination in which our musical voice was rendered somehow inappropriate or was overwhelmed and couldn't emerge or be heard, or in which the dynamics of turn-taking seemed to be strenuously competitive or masculinized, and to exclude other modes of musical mutuality, relation, or being. And a comparable situation arose in this at this free jazz meeting in 1969, where for the first time, African American and European free players came together and collaborated on a series of pieces and a recording. That's the LP set that was made from this meeting. And of course, this was done in the spirit of encompassing difference. But what several critics noticed at the time was that the two groups found it actually very difficult to fuse together in their approach to improvisation. And George Lewis, who's written a wonderful article about this meeting, talks about how the meeting exposed a vast aesthetic, methodological, social, cultural, and sonic gulf separating the two avant-gardes. Both sides welcomed and embraced difference, but there were limits in terms of their attitude to collective participation and involvement. All right, I've really run out of my time slot. I will just give you my last slide. So I think, I mean, this is actually where I am at with my thinking, and maybe we can have some discussion around this. Current theorists of deliberation are writing about, if you like, this is a limit of what can be achieved within democracy, that we can either have a fully inclusive situation that accommodates all approaches to citizenship, all approaches to how you contribute to a collective discussion, but the cost there is these incommensurable differences that I mentioned in the first quote there. In other words, the danger that actually there is no longer any common ground for agreeing a shared way forward. On the other hand, you can, if you like, establish conditions for participation in a democratic forum, but that, in the words of Stacey Clifford, who I'm quoting there, requires exclusion, that any conditions to participation will work to marginalize some participants. So as I'm suggesting at the end there, any egalitarian practice is necessarily situated between exclusion and incommensurability. And this is perhaps just something that needs to be accepted and embraced, and indeed provides some terrain that could be creatively explored, because the conditions that might exclude at any one moment are not fixed in time forever. So, you know, there's the possibility that those could be renegotiated over time as new conventions emerge that perhaps accommodate alternative ways of speaking. So I'm going to stop there because I've really run out of time, but I'd really welcome any thoughts that spring from anything I've said. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Robert. I think you can see there's probably lots of clapping. here the references. I think you emailed through the references as well.
Yes,
We can make
I'm
sure
just
that
putting them up
they're
for anybody on YouTube so they can see them. But there we are, and I will stop sharing now.
Thank you so much for a really, really thought-provoking discussion and talk, because you managed to, I think, draw us all in, despite our very, very different subdisciplinary fields. You start with something that is of very pertinent current interest and importance around democracy in our time. You locate it musicologically in the 1960s and 70s as your area of particular study. You bring in issues of political and critical theory. You also draw music psychology, including the work of our dear colleague James. You are addressing topics of ensemble performance, which is at the heart of conservatoire training and teaching and study. So they are performers and are creative practitioners, composers who are often working around with ideas of relationship in ensembles and dealing with a lot of these issues. As somebody, I've just been brought a cup of tea. I apologize for that, it's thrown me off my talk. And finally, also you deal with EDI issues, which again are so relevant to what we're discussing in all of our committees and debates, and in terms of our curriculum, in terms of how we include different voices in everything we do in conservatoire and HEI context. So thank you for that. I think that must be a first, to be able to tap into so many current and shared debates. And I'm sure we will have many questions from our colleagues. And just to say, if you are joining us on YouTube on live stream, you can bring pass your questions to research@rncm.ac.uk. Apologies, I got that slightly wrong at the start. And if we will attempt to address them, and also you can always contact Robert Adlington at any point you like. So who would like to start us off? We've got a great track record of having great, lively, fulsome discussion with our visitors and our presenters. So who would like to start us? Nick.
Hi, Robert. The word I kept expecting you to arrive at was power in the course of your presentation. And I wondered about the extent to which theories of power might be part of the background of your thinking.
Yeah, interesting point. I will have to go and chew on that a little bit, because I don't think maybe I didn't use that word once even, but it's sort of implicit behind, I think, certainly the more recent writings on deliberation that I referred to are very preoccupied with the way in which, if you like, the setup for democratic discussion in itself speaks or represents power, established kinds of power. So Habermas, who popularized this idea of democracy as discussion, has, well, quite early on, I think, was criticized for the importance he attached to a certain kind of discourse as the means by which people could share their opinions. And it was an approach to rationality that many commentators felt intrinsically discriminated against many potential participants, because not everybody had, the particular background that made it easy for them to participate in that way. So that's that critique of Habermas is an example, if you like, of how power has been seen to, if you like, get in the back door of democratic arrangements and to constrain participation. And it's such, I mean, this is one reason why I do find this subject kind of tonic at the present moment, because it sort of gives you, I think it's helpful for us all to have I mean, I felt this so strongly during the Brexit debate, which now seems several lifetimes ago, but that everyone on all sides was constantly saying that they stood for the values of democracy, but nobody was actually articulating what they meant by that. And they could do that because actually how you define democracy is, well, it's intrinsically contested. And, you know, the way in which the people govern, there is no one way. And anyway has brings costs. And so thinking of deliberation specifically, I think what theorists, I mean, deliberation has many things in its favor because it prioritizes very much attentiveness to others and willingness to reassess your own preferences. But there remains this challenge of how you set up a forum for sharing and exchanging outlooks and points of view that doesn't in itself discriminate against the kind of the equal sharing. And so power is behind all of that. And the Lupia and Norton article that I referenced, Inequality is Always in the Room, is a particularly powerful, I think, and very quite a relentless interrogation of how deliberation can bring power into the room in a way that it, on the face of it, it's not doing, because it's just to do with people sitting around. But even the room itself, I mean, that's one of the points they make, the choice of the room. A room can be intimidating to some because of its associations or, you know, whatever it might be. So it's a very vexed issue, but I think, you know, actually once you start asking the questions, then you're moving forward because you're recognizing what the constraints of your existing democratic arrangements are.
Well, here's to unrestrained deliberation. Thank you, Robert.
I think Michelle has got her hand up, would like to ask something.
Hi, Robert. Thank you very much. That was amazing. So rich and so much to think about. And it's great to see you, because I owe a lot of my own musical journey to you and your inspiration. So nice to see you. One of the things that I was thinking about was language while you were talking. I was thinking about the research that Ian Cross does on this idea of, you know, how powerful music can be in an interaction because it has indirect rather than direct meaning, and that therefore an interaction can be conflict free because people can take away their own meaning without there being anything direct that can cause dispute, and this idea of floating intentionality. And I mean, I just wonder whether, I mean, to me, that whole debate and a lot of what you were talking about just emphasizes this idea of how music is magic. You know, interacting in a musical way is really magical, and I think in many ways superior to a linguistic interaction. And maybe that's generalizing too much, but do you think that could be, is this evidence of just how great music is?
Oh, thanks for the question. Yeah, of course, so I mean, this is stuff I'm writing about at the moment, and I have questions in my own mind about, you know, the way it's sort of unfolded, and one of those is absolutely to do with, you know, what are we to make of the fact that theories of deliberation have sprung up in relation to verbal exchanges, linguistic exchanges. And of course, you know, my primary interest is in music making, which, you know, words inform it, but it's not the primary medium. And of course, improvisers, amongst other musicians, have valued absolutely the, well, in the first place, the way in which music seems to traverse linguistic boundaries. So it's not limited in the way that spoken language is, just in terms of, you know, language reflecting your cultural background and so on. Music seems to rise above those things. So I completely take on board that, and I think it's an area that I haven't sort of reached the end of my thinking about yet. So one of the things I was talking about at the end of my paper was this double level, this duality that preoccupies theories of deliberation between what you want to say and how you want to say it. And I think one important question for bringing that over to music is, can you bring it over to music? Because, you know, there's clearly a sense in which how you choose to interact with other musicians in an ensemble is part of what you want to say. The distinction that's drawn in deliberation between what and how is not necessarily so clear cut in music making. And I need to think that through a little bit. I'd welcome any thoughts anybody else has, and thank you for the reference to Bent. No, Ian Cross, you mentioned, Michelle.
Yeah, Ian Cross, yeah.
Yes, thank you. I do know his work, but not that particular phrase, floating intentionality, which is nice. I suppose on the other hand, you know, music is magic, yes, but it's also completely cluttered with interpersonal breakdown and feuds and enmities and so on. So that's really why free improvisation interests me, because there's this rhetoric of, you know, we embrace all, but actually the history points in a different direction. And so part of what I'm wanting to do is to try to understand that. How can you embrace difference and yet find yourself in a situation where you're constantly sort of offended by what other people are doing, and possibly having a understanding that there are at least two levels of difference in play in a democratic situation might be a way forward with that you can embrace difference at one level and still feel quite strongly there's only one way to do difference, if you see what I mean. So those are the sorts of ideas I'm kind of playing with. Yeah.
We've got a question, a question in the chat before I go for Nina, from Beata Peter, who says, Robert, you present the perception of equality and inequality in small ensembles as a result of social political constructs. Could personality also be part of such perception and its response? And I think your response to Michelle touched on those sorts of things.
Yeah, and so people, this is a really nice topic, because people write about personality both in ensemble music making. There's some great research. I'm going to struggle to come up with a precise reference, but I know that people have investigated the way in which different personality types affects the dynamic of an ensemble, the interaction between ensemble members, and that's very much a preoccupation in thinking about deliberation, democratic deliberation as well. And of course, in a citizens' assembly, which is a sort of formal context for deliberation, typically you will have facilitators whose job it is to try and, you know, correct the imbalance that otherwise you would be left with because of people's different personality types. But that, you know, there are other contexts for deliberation, you know, little businesses or charities or pressure groups, where that facilitation isn't practical or possible. And then, you know, personality can play a big part in sort of, if you like, upsetting the balance. And we all know, I mean, those of us who've been involved in chamber music, that's sort of one of the unpredictable joys of playing music together as well, is that you do have those imbalances, and it's kind of part of the pleasure sometimes. But it doesn't necessarily lead to egalitarianism.
Thank you. I think Nina's got a hand up.
Hi, Nina.
Hi, Robert. Thank you very much. That was really interesting, particularly to me as a member of quite a few small music ensembles. And this is more of a kind of comment or sort of invitation for further discussion than a question, I suppose. But it made me reflect on the difference between managing an ensemble. A lot of players who are performers are also managing the ensemble, and the kind of sort of democratic processes that might occur there, thinking about the choice of repertoire, the kinds of venues you play in, that might be led by one member of the ensemble, but then when the ensemble play together, those kind of roles might be different, and they might interact quite differently. So I wondered what sort of value there was in separating those things, and whether in some cases they might not be separate. You talked about string quartets, and there is, you know, obviously a leader of a quartet as well. That was another thing that kind of popped into my head. And I think, as other people have mentioned, that sometimes these relationships between performers are a bit acrimonious as a result of one player maybe taking more leadership than others really desire.
Yeah. So that's a really good point. And what I've given you today is sort of drawn out of a chapter I'm writing, and one of the bits of the chapters I left out was to do with management of ensembles, because really I was focusing on the, if you like, the processes of music making themselves. And yeah, there are separate things that can be said about management and interesting well, there's a whole array of possibilities, isn't there, in terms of the way that those, if you like, business decisions are made for ensembles, and you know, increasingly, certainly in new music ensembles, a democratic model is very popular. That there isn't any necessary carryover to the way the music making itself is conducted, and that can be done in a quite different way. So there are these complexities, I think, to thinking about democracy in ensembles. And I really just bracketed off that issue of running an ensemble, and actually it's you know, there are reasons for not doing that, because I think some of the feuds that I referred to probably arose as much from differences over the business decisions, if you like, or the, you know, which venue to which audience to target, what repertoire, stuff like that, as they did from the music making. And it may be that in the latter part of what I'm doing there, I need to be more careful to distinguish between, you know, which problematic situations are arising from the music making as opposed to the managing of the ensemble. I guess for many ensembles, those things actually in themselves are not necessarily clearly separated, and discussions will, you can tell me, Nina, but will sort of interweave, won't they? And they're not going to necessarily happen in separate times and separate places.
Definitely, yeah. I think really interesting that you can think about the two things very separately, but there will definitely be overlap between them. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
We've got a bit of a discussion going on in the chat, and I wonder whether I could ask Jane to say a few words about that and to bring it into the forum.
Nothing like being put on the spot, but I'm very happy about that. I began by engaging with Michelle, and I said, when you say music is magical, my own feeling is that it's our job, or at least that of empirical music psychologists, to try and demystify its apparent magic. What is it that makes it seem magical? And Michelle came back to me very quickly and said, sounds like a brilliant, I've just lost what she actually said. Yes, absolutely. Let's write a funding bid called Why Music is Magic. And Towie quite rightly said, I might see my job as mystifying it as much as possible. And I think, and where I've come back is to say once again, oh, Barbara, you pointed out that you know lots of complicated power relationships in quartets. And I don't know whether it's actually come up yet. Yes, the research only shows what research participants are prepared to share with researchers. And I know from my own experience how much there is that goes on behind the scenes. I mean, one of the fun things about the first kind of practice-based research that I did was that it was about my own work, and I was prepared to show some of the antagonism, some of the conflicts that arise in the practice room when they occur between a pair of musicians who've worked together for, well, at that point it was more than 35 years, and I don't know, you know, we'd been married for 30 of those years. So, you know, but that doesn't usually make it to the disinterested observer. So that's the thing about power relations. But the thing about mystification is that it is absolutely, in my view, the artist's job to mystify. But it's the scientist's job to demystify. We have different ways of going at it. And actually, Robert, what I like so much about your work is that, you know, you really are bringing together a whole series of different disciplines. And, you know, you get these marvelous, the only thing I can think of to describe it is bouncings off when you as you combine. It's not possible to combine, but you get really interesting sparks from putting them together. And I'm really looking forward to reading the chapter when it comes out.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, bouncing off is nice. I like that.
Interesting expression. We've got, thank you for that, Jane. I'm sorry for putting you on the spot. We've got a question from Nicola. We'd like to go next, Nicola.
Thanks, Barbara. And thanks so much, Robert. That was so illuminating and stimulating.
Thank you.
My own research is slightly related to this area, and I've done some empirical work with new ensembles looking at music decision making over time and how it emerges. And I was wondering if you've got any thoughts about the democratic process and whether time plays a part in that, and how different groups respond to the different contexts they find themselves in, and how they develop either in the short term or indeed in the longer term.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So the thing I am aware of, it's a kind of obvious point, but that time is considered to be a crucial factor in, if you like, good practice in deliberation. That reflection and not feeling rushed is, so if you want to convene a citizens' assembly, it's going to take a while, because you need to give people time to adjust. And it's this sort of classic thing of, I mean, but I hope I didn't give the impression that I was in any way advocating against deliberation, because I think God knows we need more of it. And this sort of classic phenomenon of putting people in a room who have sharply opposed views, and the simple act of getting them to listen to each other and to share life experiences and perspectives and so on. And there's a lot of research done on the way in which this helps to draw in the extremes of opinion, and that people start to find middle grounds that they can inhabit. But of course, that's only going to happen if there's enough time for that process to take place. So I don't know if I can say anything more specific than that, but except to say that within deliberation, it's certainly understood that time is a crucial variable. And it's one of the interesting differences with some kinds of music making. Certainly if you're wanting to talk about the actual act of performing together as somehow reflecting a democratic interaction, of course, one of the things with any music making that has a degree of flexibility or sort of spontaneity to it is that it's very much, there's a very high time pressure. I mean, you're not, things are changing all the time, and you're having to respond in the moment to it, and that's part of the excitement of that kind of performance. But it's an entirely different situation from being in a room where you're reflecting and being able to to let other people's views settle and so on. So I'm sorry, that's not a very helpfully specific answer, but I'm sure you're onto something. Yeah, I mean, we're all in a rush all the time, aren't we? And performers as much as anybody. But what you can achieve when you're not in a rush is, you know, free improvisation would be an interesting area to look at, because some of the leading practitioners, let's say from the 70s, were very sniffy about audiences, and actually they, you know, an audience really wasn't the main issue. They needed to be together and to refine their practice over long periods of time. So there might be something there that you could pick up on.
Yeah, I noticed you've used, is it David Borgo?
Yes.
His work looks at concepts of, you know, complex systems and emergence, and I know he's looked at some of this. So maybe that's where this kind of comes together a little bit. But yeah.
Thank you. I'd like to know more about your stuff. So
it would be great to hook up. Thank you.
We have a question from Tawi.
Thanks, Barbara. Hi, Robert. Thanks. That was an absolutely fascinating talk. I've really enjoyed it. I think this might tie in with the discussion about mystification, actually, because when you was it the Emerson Quartet who had the quote where you said they're a model of democracy, but the bit that stuck out to me at the end is they all agree that the music is the boss. And then I was going to touch on that anyway, but you mentioned it later as this factor of some ensembles where I don't know if it's just a pragmatic thing, but this notion that they have together that they're serving the music or that they're deferent to the music in some way. And I was just wondering if you could say a bit more about that mechanism, because if they really believe that, is it actually a democracy? It's a sort of hierarchy, isn't it? If they're really serving something that they really believe. And it reminded me of sort of the way we symbolically, I suppose at this point, have a monarch, but you know, everyone is deferent to the Queen still, even though in practice she doesn't actually step in that often. I was just wondering if you could say a bit more about that.
Yes, yeah. I mean, you're quite right to highlight that, and it's literally the next sentence, I think, isn't it? In that little blurb after extolling the democratic virtues of the ensemble, the cellist says the music is boss, and so it certainly raises questions. You know, I suppose one can work for, you know, it's not impossible to think of situations where one is working to the instruction of a manager, but in doing that you are collaborating democratically with your team in order to achieve the goals set by your manager. So I mean, there are employment situations, for instance, where that's it's not an unfamiliar situation, and at one level there is a democratic process going on, the team deciding collectively you know, how to fulfill the vice chancellor's edict, let's say. So the fact of there being a boss doesn't necessarily mean there is a lack of democracy. But the democracy is serving other ends. I mean, the thing that really, I think, troubles me about the Emerson Quartet example is that, I mean, wonderful quartet, and I don't know the musicians individually at all, but if you look at them, you would certainly imagine that they hail from very similar backgrounds and have very similar life experiences. So the fact that they can achieve a democratic outcome, I'm not saying it's not democratic, but it's not necessarily a huge achievement. And so there is a slight sense of a value being attached to a musical practice that actually, you know, it's not solving the problems of multicultural society, obviously, and that's a little bit what worries me about some of those attachments of the idea of democracy to those practices. That if you have a group of people who basically are like-minded from the outset, then bringing them together into consensus is a lovely thing, and they, you know, wonderful performances, but it is a different kind of achievement from bringing together hugely divergent populations to some kind of common view. And that's, in a way, a quartet is not a good model for how we do that. And it's sometimes presented as if it is, I think. So I suppose that's the concern I have about that.
Thanks, Robert. And you've given me the image of music as a middle manager now. So.
John, would you like to ask a question?
It's more of a comment. I declare an interest. I'm a former member of the Fitzwilliam String Quartet, which was the resident quartet at York University for many years, and was extremely successful, especially after I'd left it. Firstly, as a member of a professional quartet, you've really got to get the work done. And that can often mean a benign dictatorship rather than a democracy. If you were too democratic, you spend too much time talking about whether it should be piano or forte. And if you're over democratic, you end up it being mezzo forte. And the result of that is that you end up with a rather anonymous interpretation, which is neither here nor there. So based on my experience, we didn't go for democracy. We did have a benign dictatorship. The other thing that emerges as you play more and more together is that you don't speak to each other at all. You don't make decisions based on what you say to each other. You just play, and then you play it again. And the interpretation emerges not from words, but from the music itself.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, there's no question.
No. That's good. I did allude, I think, somewhere to pragmatics, and it's clear from some of this literature that I've read that, of course, musicians will often prefer a very clear leadership situation because it gives you efficiencies to meet the desired goal by a certain deadline, and that's often the best way to go about your work. And the second point about playing and not talking, I think there's a quote somewhere. There's a famous empirical study, Jane might be able to remember the reference, of 20 British string quartets. It's 30 years old now or something. But there's a lovely quote, I think, in that of either we talk or we fight. No, either we play or we fight. I have to get it the right way around. Either we play or we fight. And that resonated, I think, a little bit with what you were saying. And of course, even within a quartet, there is still you still have four individuals who are bringing different perspectives on a piece. So it's not to say that there isn't a negotiation of difference taking place in a string quartet, and that's a very fascinating thing, especially when that negotiation is being conducted musically. It's really an extraordinary process. All I really wanted to do in my remark on the Emerson Quartet was to make clear the different nature of that interaction from some of the bigger challenges that democracy faces, if you will.
I think Nicola has identified the reference that you were looking for, which will be in the chat, so we can pass on to you. I do want to ask Larry if he has a question to contribute.
Hi, Robert. Thank you very much for your talk. Yeah, I was really interested in sort of 1960s and 70s free improvisation as an agitating force, but also as the kind of problems that you identify. And I would extend a kind of sonic tribalism to that as well from my own experience. And I wondered if you see some contemporary trends in collective and in collectives and groups that prioritize distributed creativity, where improvisation, notation and score and other media are given a much more even-handed approach, and where even the personnel and the nature of what a piece of music is very fluid in those situations. And if you see that as a contemporary extension of what you're talking about in those free improvisation historical examples.
Yeah, thanks. Great question. What I'm aware of is in the community at Huddersfield an interest in kinds of egalitarianism, I suppose, and that can be expressed in different ways, whether it's a composer and some performers or some co-composer / performers. It seems to me that the interest in exploring ideas of equality is certainly alive and well in current creative practice. I'm, though, going to struggle to come up with specific contemporary examples, and indeed I would welcome any examples that anybody is aware of practitioners who are exploring new ways to negotiate that tension that I was talking about right at the end between a full inclusion that gives rise to unintelligibility and the creation of some kind of common ground, or the articulation of some kind of common ground, with the risk that that brings of excluding participants. I think it's a dilemma of democracy that preoccupies theorists of deliberation. And it seems to me, although it's at one level, it's a sort of, it's a kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? At the one level, it demarcates a limit to what an egalitarian community can be, which is perhaps a bit disappointing. But another level, I think it sort of opens up a territory that could be creatively explored, and it could be explored in music making as well. So I'm sorry, I can't come up with any specific examples, and I'd welcome any suggestions of groups or ensembles that you think are interested in this territory, and I will go and find out more about them.
I think I was thinking of things like the Canadian L'Ensemble Girl and Les Femmes Savantes, and the difficulty is that the specific work doesn't really exemplify it, but the body of work does, because it's inherently very fluid and difficult to pin down. Yeah. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll chase you for those references later on. Thanks.
We have a question from Devon.
Hey, Robert. Really great presentation. It's really fantastic to see you as well, seeing as how I started at Nottingham and now I'm starting my PhD here. So it's a great way to kick off the year. I was going to kind of ask you about this, the two types of differentiation and relationship to kind of work as a composer. Over the summer, I worked with two of my other colleagues here at the department to write a piece for Zoom technology that was kind of using this idea of giving kind of a lot of information back to the performers for them to make decisions and kind of mold the piece in how they wanted to. And I think the thing that the three of us found while we were working on that piece was definitely that we were caught between those two types of differentiation, between this idea of like cooperation and kind of bringing everything together, and also this idea of making everything really disparate and making it quite obvious that everyone's parts were separate and independent. So yeah, just kind of wanted to see what your thoughts were on that.
Well, I'd love to know more about it, so you have to send me a link.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I don't know whether there's something interesting around Zoom and working at a distance. And I wouldn't be surprised if there were people looking into, what difference it makes, I suppose, to between being in a room together and being in separate spaces, who are thinking about that in terms of the processes of deliberation, because there is this sort of anxiety around the associations that come with particular spaces for convening people. Yeah, I'm just speculating, I'm not sure. But I think that that distancing is, well, it's clearly also a challenge for ensemble performance, but one that can be creatively explored as well. So yeah, I'm not sure I've got anything very perceptive to say, but the work sounds interesting. So please send me a link and I'll look into it. It's great to see you, Devon. Yeah, congratulations on the PhD. Yeah.
Thank you.
There are lots of really interesting comments in the chat, but we could perhaps look at some of these in when we go into a less formal mode, because I'm going to invite people quite soon to a virtual chat at the bar, which it's not quite the same as going to the bar. But before we do that, I think Annika would like to ask something.
Yes, thanks. Robert, thank you so much for the paper. It's a brilliant start to the year. I really enjoyed that. Thank you very much. I have a question which ties in with something that Keith just actually posted in the chat, which is disanalogies between music performance and deliberative democracy. So he spoke about the time aspect of it, and I was wondering, especially coming from what John said about the experiences of actually performing, of course, professionally, and just having to make sure that at the time when you're supposed to have your performance, you have the thing ready. I was wondering whether levels of professionalism are another kind of or play another kind of key role really in this question of how far you can take the analogy between deliberative democracy and music performance, because it sounded a few times, I mean, correct me if I'm making up a pattern that doesn't work, I have a tendency to do that, but if there is the relationship between the more professional ensembles get and possibly the less room there is for these kind of genuine deliberative democratic decision processes. And of course, when you think about professional politics and democracy, these people are also not amateurs, they're also professionals, of course. I wonder if that is another, besides power really, and personality and time, another factor that kind of shakes things up a little bit.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Yeah, what you say makes a lot of sense, and I've made note of it. So I guess my talk is building on something of a history of relating small ensemble performance to democracy, which, as we've seen, thrives in the present day as a way of almost selling chamber music. But it's important to, of course, important to recognize that the word democracy is often used in a quite a casual way, and almost as a kind of synonym for equality or some other arrangements. And I think possibly I could be accused of making too much of the word and this history of using the word in relation to this practice. John's description of how a quartet practice evolves, I think is salutary and important, because there are these very crucial distinctions, which is part of the story I wanted to tell as well. But I'll go away and think about that idea of professionalization, because that's an interesting one. And I'm sort of, as you can probably tell, I'm navigating a little bit between, on the one hand, the fact that the discourse around small ensembles has used this word over quite a long period. That on the one hand, and on the other hand, what is in some areas of musical practice a genuine desire to explore egalitarianism. And the two aren't quite coterminous, I think, probably. And my book is about democracy, so it's sort of my excuse into talking about that. But I could probably do a better job of delineating those two territories that I'm kind of perhaps squeezing together a little bit, because you can be equal without being democratic, or equality can manifest itself in a way that is quite different from a democratic arrangement. And I think it's important to avoid attaching too much importance to a kind of casual use of the word democracy to talk about arrangements that are, interestingly equal, but observe different dynamics and different processes, something like that. I'm now improvising as I am in all these answers, by myself, moreover.
I think it's time to thank you, Robert, for a wonderfully stimulating talk and actually you covered so much, and I'm sure there'll be people asking you questions by email or other means afterwards. What is really fascinating is what is done in the name of democracy, both in terms of politics that we're familiar with, but also in terms of ensembles and the different layers and complications and the lack of consensus around it, actually. And that interests me a lot of my work that deals with ideas of consensus and how they're formed and shaped, and the power relations that go into all of that, with some voices being heard over others inevitably. So it's wonderful to get an insight into your work. I need to get the edited collection, but also look forward to your monograph when it appears. So on behalf of everyone, I'd like to thank you sincerely for a really fascinating talk, and also to invite anyone who wants to hang around for a virtual chat in the bar, even if just for a short time. We will turn off the live stream and go into a slightly different, more informal mode, and maybe you can have a chance to look at the chat to see all the things you probably didn't get the chance to look at.
I will save it. I will save it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody,
Thank you.
for being here, and thank you for the great questions. Really enjoyed talking with you all. So thanks a lot. Thank you.